Hello students, I am Dr. L.K. Das, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Department of HSS IIT Turkey. Welcome to another lecture of the NPTEL course Power and Politics in Contemporary India, a Sociological View. Today in this lecture, we will discuss this very significant question. How can we understand the nature of Indian state and its political evolution after independence? This question links directly to our previous discussions of Ranajit Guha's work on the pre-colonial as well as colonial regimes, in which he speaks about dominance without hegemony, in which the colonial state ruled over the Indian subcontinent through the coercion as well as some bits of persuasion, but there was never any hegemonic the role of the or hegemonic governmentality that the colonial state had on the Indian masses and the Indians as such. That is the reason why so many Indians fought for independence, and in 1947 we gained independence. But Ranajit Guha's work was limited to the colonial period. So in today's lecture, as well as in the next two lectures, we are going to discuss what has happened and how do we understand the transformations that have happened in the Indian state or in India from the perspective of three scholars. Today, we are going to discuss the works of Sudipta Kaviraj. In the next class, we will discuss the work of Professor Pranab Bardhan, and in the class after that, we are going to discuss the work of Professor Partha Chatterjee. By bringing all these three scholars together, we will try to understand how transformation in India has been understood from a political sociological perspective. So let us start. So as you can see with this photograph, he is Professor Sudipta Kaviraj. He studied in India. For a very long time, he also taught political science in India. But although he was a political scientist, and he is a political scientist, but his works usually bring together social and political theories, because his idea is that only political theory or only social theory cannot significantly interpret what is happening in a very complex society like India. And in this lecture, we are going to discuss his ideas on passive revolution, particularly what happened between 1947 and in the late 1980s. So in today's lecture, we are going to discuss Gramsci's passive revolution and how the Kaviraj reinterpreted passive revolution looking at the Indian context. We are also going to discuss the nature of Indian state and ruling coalitions. Keep this term in mind, ruling coalitions, okay? Then we will discuss about the political periodization from 1947 to 1980s, and then what are the theoretical contributions that Professor Kaviraj has made. Now, looking at the context in which he is writing this work, we need to understand that up until 1960s, 1967, 1968, Indian state, particularly in the context of sociology, was understood through a structural functionalist periodization and structural functionalist interpretation, which essentially meant that there was no scope for understanding conflict. Whether it was M.N. Srinivas or it was others, they looked at the Indian society, they looked at the Indian state from a modernization viewpoint. That means all the interventions that are being made by the Indian state in terms of green revolution, in terms of irrigation facilities, in terms of democracy, in terms of parliamentary democracy, so on and so forth. What are the implications that are happening on the Indian society and how different groups within Indian society are reacting to it. In the 1960s, a classic division happened. A classic division happened, and it was classic because with the 1968-69 student revolts throughout the world, the structural functionalists did not have an answer to understand power relationships, because within their conceptual framing there was no idea or there was no the framing as to how do we understand conflict. So, Marxists, with the help of Marx and scholars who followed Marx's work, they tried to reinterpret what was happening in the Indian context and why the crisis happened. So, two groups of scholars emerged within this framework, within this dialogue. The first ones, Professor Kaviraj calls them as structural. The second, he calls them as political or actor based. The structural ones, they argued in terms of, again, they took the green revolution, they took other kind of transformations that were happening, but they looked at it from the very specific point of capitalism, class formation and social coalescence. So, what does this mean? It means that they are looking at the Indian state as a capitalist state, and the governments that are there, that are coming again and again through periodic elections, they are also supporting capitalism. And through these capitalist interventions, what kind of class formations are happening? Is there a class formation in terms of bourgeois and proletariat, or there are different kinds of class formations happening in different sectors of society, whether it is in fisheries, in agriculture, in industries, in capital intensive agriculture as well as capital intensive industries? And what are the social coalitions that can be understood? For example, Professor M. N. Srinivas gave the formulation of dominant castes, which had an outsized impact on the social and political as well as economic order of the society. The next group, whom Kaviraj calls as political or actor based, were leaders, parties, policies and events. So, they were looking at specific events, they are looking at the Congress party system, or they are looking at leaders like Nehru, leaders like Patel and other kind of leaders, and how they have worked it out in India as well as in the regional areas. And how certain policies, whether the policies were formulated in accordance to the 5-year plans, or certain events like the India-Pakistan wars, or like the India-China war, or the events such as introduction of green revolution technologies in northern India, and what political implications it had on India. So, both these groups were Marxists, but the way a scholar like Kaviraj is looking even at this Marxist interpretation of Indian society and transformations that are happening post 1947, is that he is clubbing them together, that their ideas, although crucial, are not enough as singular beings to understand Indian society. That is the reason why he says that although Marxist understanding of Indian society is required, but we cannot transplant Marxist and other Marxist ideas that had their germination in Europe or in other nations in the Indian context. So, we have to understand what is happening in India, even though our concepts, our theories can be borrowed from the global north. That is the reason why he claims that we have to understand politics as indeterministic. It is contingent, it is open-ended, but yet bounded by structural limits. And in this lecture, we will discuss it subsequently. So, that is the reason why he calls India, or he wants to look at India or the pre-liberalization India as late backward and post-colonial capitalism. So, he is not saying that there is no capitalism. He claims that there is capitalism, but this capitalism is contingent and not hegemonic. So, unlike other areas, other nations where the state might be dependent on capitalist reproduction, here capitalist reproduction entirely depends on the role of the state. To understand this, he brings Antonio Gramsci's concept of passive revolution. So, passive revolution, in a brief, we had discussed previously the lecture on Gramsci, but as I had promised in that class, So, in today's lecture, we will see how an Indian scholar is using Gramsci's idea of passive revolution in the Indian context, while critiquing the passive revolution itself and Gramsci's understanding of passive revolution itself. Now, to give it the summary of what Gramsci's passive revolution actually meant. So, the passive revolution was a revolution from above, not below. It has features like transformation without mass mobilization, elites reorganize society to preempt radical change, modernization is equivalent to preservation of older domination, and he gives the example, or Gramsci gives the example of Italian unification in terms of the Cavour and French Revolution. So, how it is relevant to the late developers? Because bourgeoisie is too weak, state drives transformation. Now, because I have already discussed this before, I will not get into the details of it. Suffice it to say that when Gramsci is giving the example of Italian reunification and French Revolution in terms of passive revolution, he argues that French Revolution happened from below. There was mass mobilization and mass coalition building that happened, in which the bourgeoisie, the other trading classes, working classes, women and others, they came together to completely transform the society itself. Whereas in the Italian unification, it was unification from above, in which through sheer the military power and intellectual power, the Cavour and others, they dominated the entire landscape of the present day Italy or Italian speaking areas and converted it to an Italian state. As a matter of fact, although it is not much discussed in terms of passive revolution, the same thing happened in Germany. A dominant Prussia within the chancellorship of Bismarck, through its military power and through the negotiations, brought unification of all German speaking countries while excluding that of Austria, because Austria during that time in the late 19th century was also a very strong kingdom and very strong power. So, this is about how something is happening from above. Kavirajas intervenes by saying that we cannot understand the Indian state simply as an instrument of the bourgeoisie. We cannot also claim that it is semi-feudal awaiting socialist revolution. Although we have not discussed it as of now, but this also has its backdrop in the modes of production debate in India, which went on for almost 15 long years, in which the debate was whether the Indian state is an instrument of the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class, or it is semi-feudal. If it is semi-feudal, that means a socialist revolution is round the corner, and with that socialist revolution, transformation can happen. Kavirajas, with the advantage of hindsight, claims that it is neither semi-feudal nor it is an exclusive instrument of the bourgeoisie. Rather, Indian state is bourgeois, but is in a complex mediated sense. As I said, capitalism in India survives through state, not through the market, and we are talking about between 1947 to 1980s. This is a pre-liberalization period. So, in other words, while the Marxist understanding of Indian state or Indian society was about looking at mode of production and economics, Kavirajas argues that we have to look at politics, not something that is subsumed under economics, rather as an independent entity. Politics need to be understood as an independent framework as to how politics is impacting economics and economics is impacting politics, rather than economics having an outward or outsized impact on politics. So why is he calling Indian state as bourgeois? He calls it as bourgeois because there is a class dominance in which the bourgeoisie or the big capitalist class has a deep impact on the Indian state. And historically also parliamentary democracy is always called liberal or bourgeois in its form, and India also has a liberal democracy in which we follow most of the principles of liberalism. For example, we have individual rights, we have individual rights which are transformed as fundamental rights, we have duties, plus we also have private property, which is very bourgeois, very liberal in its form. So, anytime we want to understand Indian parliamentary democracy, we have to understand what are its underlying ideas and underlying forms. So, and third, in terms of function, its role is in the reproduction of capital. And reproduction of capital is not just about reproduction of private capital, but also state capital. That is the reason why we have public sector units as well as private sector companies. But it is a bourgeois state, but it is fragile because bourgeois dominance is not complete. In Gramscian term, it doesn't have hegemony. Like we had discussed about the hegemony of the colonial state or dominance of the colonial state, similarly, the bourgeois in India does not or did not have hegemony. So, because it did not have hegemony, so how did it rule? Or how, so can we still call Indian state as a bourgeois state? This is where the work of the Kaviraj is very significant in our understanding or in our analysis of Indian society. He brings in this this Gramscian concept of ruling bloc. And within that ruling bloc, he brings bourgeoisie, landed elites, and bureaucratic managerial class. Now, unlike other scholars who either focused on this group, or this group, by bringing all of them together, he claims that if this is the Indian state represented as IS, so we have the three in terms of bourgeoisie, in terms of landed elites, and in terms of bureaucratic managerial class. They form the three corners of this triangle, and they are the ones who control and decide what is happening in the Indian state. Interestingly, and I said this is one of the very crucial contributions of Kaviraj, is because he is not looking at these three as independent entities, rather he is calling them as a coalition. Now, is this coalition on the face, or is it that they have decided that they are going to come as a coalition force, as a coalition party, and then decide on something? Then that would be a misnomer. This is not like a political party in which if you have NDA or you have UPA, several parties are coming together and bringing to the forefront something related to a particular policy or a particular idea. Rather, this is a coalition which is quite fragmented. This is a coalition which is contextual, and this is a coalition which brings its own conditions on the table. Do they all agree with each other? The answer is no. They do not always agree with each other. Do they disagree with each other? Most of the times. Now, if we look at the bourgeoisie, so what is the role of bourgeoisie in this coalition? As we said, The bourgeoisie of 1947 to 1980 could be who? The Tatas, the Birlas, the Bajaj, the Godrej, and many others. But these were the pan-Indian nature of bourgeoisie. The Tatas had been there as the powerful elite from the 19th century. They were a powerful elite during the British Empire. They were a powerful elite even after India got independence. The same goes with Bajaj, or the same goes with Birlas. As a matter of fact, the Birlas were instrumental in bankrolling many of the activities that were organized by the Congress party as well as others. The Godrej and others, they also did the same thing, and they had a very critical impact on the way policies were created in India. If you are interested, you can go back and read how particularly from the 1936 onwards, they created a sustain, and 1936 happens to be a very critical period, because that is when the nationalist movement in India, or the leaders in India, started having a feeling that India might get independence in near future. So this bourgeoisie, they started mobilizing forces in order to create an ecosystem in which, in the post-independence period, they would remain as elites, and state would be very critical by supporting these elites. So what did this bourgeoisie do? This bourgeoisie created something called the Bombay Plan. It is available on the internet. You can go back and read the document. The document very clearly states that in the post-independence period, for the time being, the state or the independent Indian state should be at the helm of affairs, because even though they were at the commanding heights, these few families were at the commanding heights, still they did not have the resources for the development of a very poverty-stricken and poor Indian country. So they would like the state to take the different aspects of industrialization till the Indian state or Indian society or Indian economy reaches a stage wherein we have a trained manpower, we have enough economic leverage for individuals, for families to consume, so that the bourgeoisie can enter into those fields. So anytime you hear a debate that the Nehruvian government, or with its socialist policies, created the bureaucratic system of socialist governance, go back and read what is written in the Bombay Plan. It will be enlightening for you, because it opens up the misinformation that many scholars or many not so scholars that have been spreading around what has been happening in the post 1947 period. So because their name was famous, because they were the ones who could generate a specific ideology, that is the reason why they are the number one. The second were the landed elites, and here we are talking about a period in which land reforms had not happened to its complete end, and before the Indira Gandhi came to power, and she abolished even the privy purses that were given to the ex-princely states. So landed elites were both a creation of the pre-independence period as well as the post-independence period. And as it was discussed in the dominant caste framework of M.N. Srinivas, they had the rural electoral power and agrarian dominance. Because they were landed elite, so they could mobilize people who were dependent on them for work, were dependent on them on livelihood. And many a times these landed elites were caste elites also, or upper caste elites. At the same time, because they had agrarian dominance, because in terms of ownership of land, as well as in terms of green revolution technologies. So these landed elites had a vested interest in how the state runs and what policies are going to be brought out or formulated. That is the reason why uh, there has been a lot of discussion about the agrarian castes and how they mobilized themselves into the political organizations, political parties, associations, so on and so forth, to mobilize themselves and act as a very strong coalition of ruling as part of a ruling bloc. The third is the bureaucratic managerial class, because they are bringing technical expertise, institutional control and ideological leadership. Technical expertise and institutional control, because this bureaucracy is not just about IAS and IPS officers. This is about the IAS, IPS and other kind of officers also managing the PSUs. So they were both bureaucratic as well as managerial, and because of which they are a distinct class. So this class is very interesting because in traditional understanding this cannot be a class in the Marxist framework, but because of their position as part of a ruling bloc, they are very significant. Think about the public sector units, or think about the employees in of central government, the employees of state government and others. What do? They have a basic as well as they have a fundamental way to protect their own class. That is the reason why whatever they are doing it in order for Indian state to function in a particular way. And bureaucracy becomes a mediator between these classes and acts as a political intelligence. So whether it is the bourgeoisie or it is the landed elites, anything that happens through bureaucracy. So lobbying is another very significant aspect, because whatever needed to be done by the bourgeoisie, landed elites or the managerial class had to be done through this bureaucracy. So coalition, according to the Kaviraj, or the ruling bloc in terms of coalition, is a condition, not accident, of bourgeois dominance. So that is the reason why I am saying go back to the Bombay Plan, and it will tell you how the things were created even before we attained independence. So why this entire ruling bloc is part of the Nehruvian passive revolution. So was independence movement a passive revolution in India? The answer is may not be true. But when you discuss what is happening in the post 1947 period, so the argument goes that Nehruvian period, particularly between 1947 to 1964, when Nehru passed away, a lot of possibilities were there for the revolution. But Nehruvian state very specifically created conditions to bypass this revolution, and whatever transformation happened from above, not from below. That is the reason why it is a passive revolution and not an active revolution. Now let us get into why it is a passive revolution. First, because of the independence movement, there was a possibility for radical transformation. But Congress strategy was that first have land reforms, but in a very diluted way. So on the face there were land reforms, but most of the states in India did not follow its suit. That is the reason why in many areas land reforms did not take place. Second is the mass mobilization. Independence movement in India was about mass mobilization. So post independence, the first thing Nehruvian state did was to demobilize, because the ideological justification was that we have already attained the independence. So why do we need to have a mass mobilization? If we have mass mobilization, that means the India would not remain democratic, and which also means that whatever we have achieved, we are going to lose it. So for the greatest common good, there should not be any mass mobilization. That is another reason why between 1947 and 1964, till the Nehru was at the helm, India witnessed hardly any mass mobilization. Planning and industrialization were highly bureaucratized through 5-year plans. Democracy was there. So, this is not to say that India was not a democracy. India was a democracy, and India is still a democracy. But this democracy was managed in favor of this ruling bloc. So, if it is about the ruling bloc and how it is managed, that is it is about this the stage of 4-phase implementation of the passive revolution. So, Nehruvian state was all about modernization from above, not from below. And through this, there was some amount of growth, but most importantly, there was preservation of the ruling elites. Tatas remained as elites, nobody was there to challenge them. Birlas remained as elites, nobody was there to challenge them. The upper dominant castes, both in terms of agrarian castes as well as the twice born castes, they remained at the elite, the upper layer of society. Nothing substantially changed in between. But it was not hegemonic, as all whatever we saw, it was all about coalitions. So these coalitions created fissures between each one of them. So it was always about short-term benefits rather than about long-term outcomes. So whether it was Indira Gandhi's centralization of power, or about populism, or about emergency, we saw that there is a crisis of legitimacy and governability. That is another reason why the post-colonial Indian state or the bourgeoisie failed to attain hegemony. Again, Kaviraj is periodizing the entire phase, and how do we look at coalition struggles in terms of passive revolution, in which the first phase is of 1946 to 50, in which Congress was a dominant force under Nehru, but there were different factions, and these factions were always at conflict with each other. There was a socialist faction, there was a radical left faction, there was a centrist faction, there was a right-wing faction, and there was an ultra-right-wing faction. So somebody wanted economic liberalization in 1947 itself, somebody wanted to have more socialist understanding, so on and so forth. So 50 to 56, when we had the first 5-year plan, so land reforms were diluted and planning started having from above. So through planning and not through land reforms and mass mobilization, we are going to have a revolution in India. 1956 to 64 were very crucial, because here we had the second 5-year plan and third 5-year plan, in which industrialization happened at a very rapid scale following the Soviet logic, that the state has to invest heavily in the development of capitalist or capital intensive industries, so that a base can be created on which others would stand up. But between 1965 and 1987, or after the demise of Nehru, we had a lot of issues, which he calls as instability and crisis. There was centralization of power, there was the populism, there was emergency, and the hegemony weakened extensively, particularly till the time Indira Gandhi was in power. She brought certain centralizing forces which helped the Indian economy, but at the same time her populist the features and her the tendency for centralization and authoritarianism kind of pushed back the bourgeoisie as well as the other kind of coalitions. So, in a way this gave rise to whatever changes and transformations we are witnessing in the post 1990 period, rise of different new coalitions, whether it is in terms of religion, in terms of caste or in terms of the regionalism. So, what are the key theoretical contributions of Sudipta Kaviraj? So, when he is talking about passive revolution, unlike many others, he did not transplant Gramsci's passive revolution without contextualizing it. So, the second, it leads to the second point, that passive revolution is not a one-time event, rather it is a continuous process. New forms of coalitions are getting built up from time to time in order to rule. So, the state can remain as a bourgeois even if bourgeoisie is weak. If you remember our previous discussions about the nature of state, right? The classic Miliband-Pulantzas debate, whether a state is bourgeoisie or a state can be bourgeois where bourgeoisie is relatively weak. So, ruling bloc as part of coalition is what can be understood here. And each constituent of this ruling bloc also have their autonomous identities. That is the reason why autonomy is very significant here. And we have to keep in mind that when we are talking about autonomy, it is political autonomy, it is economic autonomy, as well as autonomy in the very sense of how you are being part of a coalition. Are you completely subsumed under one idea or there are variations within them? So, that is the reason why he claims that passive revolution in India is ongoing, incomplete and unstable. So, this is the work that we primarily cited here, but in order to understand more about passive revolution and the Indian time period that we have been discussing here, you can read Perry Anderson's work, Partha Chatterjee, Frankel, Kohli and other works of Sudipta Kaviraj. Thank you.